All right. So, yeah, this is the essentially the first week. It's actually the second week of these sessions for the course. And where you should be in your progress at this point is through chapters 1 through 3. And chapters 1 through 3, pretty straightforward. Um, they're kind of foundational information. I'll share the screen here and we'll jump in and just I think, yeah, this is the screen I want to share. All right, so if you can see the screen here, the class that you should be going through, the residential solar installation and design, you'll find that under online courses on solarpvtraining.com. So once you jump in here, and hopefully this is very much all review, otherwise, clearly you haven't gotten through chapters 1 through 3 if you're not in here. But I just thought I'd use this screen just to help walk us through a little bit about the background information here. It's broken into the various sections. So I think chapter 1, typically people don't have a lot of issues with it. The reference tool for the NEC, that's really designed just to let you get used to looking things up in the NEC. Sometimes they change that. So if there is an issue of trying to get logged in, it can be problematic. I think they still have the ability for you to set up a temporary account. So that's helpful. And then, of course, you can go through the chapter 1 review quiz. The review quizzes require that you get an 80% on the quiz before it's going to consider that being completed. That's true on all of these quizzes. So if you don't get an 80% the first time, not a big deal. Just take it as many times as you need to. I think that will help you prepare for the certification exam that's at the end of this. The questions on the certification exam are not as difficult, I believe, as the questions that are at the end of each chapter, because a lot of my questions are intentionally tricky. Um, they're they're also there to give you alternatives. So there's a lot of negative. So what I mean by that is says like, which of the following is not a typical panel specification? Well, then I'd have three of them that are and one of them that's not. Well, the reason I like to structure the questions that way is because at least it teaches you these three are. But on an exam, you oftentimes might just read over that not and miss the question because your brain did not register that it was asking you a negative. So on the exam, they typically will do these in the positive. So it will say which of the following is, and there will only be one correct answer. So people usually find that a little bit easier. In chapter 2, we're talking about the emerging technologies, and that's the one that I find people struggle with, and that's what I'm going to highlight here today, is the IV curve. So let me go ahead and get out of the share mode. I'll just have to figure out, just give you a second there. Okay, great. All right, so let me just talk a little bit about the IV curve. And the IV curve, I hope, is pretty simple, but I stands for amps, V stands for volts, and the amps are typically going to be over here on this axis and the V over here. Now, every solar panel will have an IV curve that looks something approximating this. And it basically is going to tell you that as you increase volts, as voltage goes up, output will go up as well, up to a point, and then after that, the output will actually decline. And I think of this like, if let's say that we're talking about watts, and that's what this curve is showing, because watts equals amps times volts. So I'm just thinking that if watts were measuring how many cars are going through an intersection, and volts is the number of cars, as you add more cars into the traffic pattern, the amount of cars going through that intersection will continue to increase until it reaches a point where they begin to interfere with each other. So somebody taps their brakes, and then you're getting, less and less. The traffic slows, and then down here you would achieve absolute gridlock. Nothing's moving. So that's kind of the concept that we're talking about. Over here, there would be no cars. Over here, absolute gridlock. So if you think about it, if this is 5 volts, 10, 15, 20, 25, and then this is 30 volts. And let's say that's 1 amp, 2 amps, 3 amps, 4, 5, 6. Well, at 0 volts, 0 times 6, well, that's going to be 0, right? So and this is ISC, amps short circuit. It's the theoretical maximum amperage, but at ISC, nothing is moving. There is no power flow, so it's 0 watts. So that's a bad situation, basically a short circuit. And that is the maximum amperage, theoretically, but there is no power. So it's a bad situation. Now let's say we go up to 5 volts. Let's assume it's still at 6 amps. Well, then you're going to have 30 watts. Then you go to 10. If it's still close to 6, maybe it's 50, maybe it's 5.9. So we'd be at 59 watts. We go to 15, and let's say now it's at 5 amps. 15 times 5 is going to be 75 watts. We come out here to 20, and let's say it's 20 and 4. Well, now we're at 80 watts. So you see, as we've added voltage, the watts, the power has continued to increase. But now we jump out here to 25, and let's say it's right at 3. Well, 25 is 75 watts, 25 times 3. So it comes to a point where the maximum amount of power can be generated by a solar panel, and that is, logically enough, called the maximum power point. And we abbreviate that as Pmax, maximum power, or MPP, maximum power point. Those are typically the abbreviations you're going to see, Pmax or MPP. All right, that's the maximum power point. Then there's the maximum voltage. Well, that's VOC, voltage open circuit. Once again, at VOC, you're generating zero power. So that's a bad situation, and ISC is a bad situation. Those are the theoretical maximum amperage for ISC and the theoretical maximum voltage for VOC. In fact, if you were to test a solar panel with a meter without it attached to anything, you're measuring the VOC. It's not generating any power, but you can measure the voltage. You cannot measure amps unless power is flowing, because amps are current. And without motion, without current, there's no current. So it's a theoretical measurement. Okay, so those are the two most. Well, why do we even worry ourselves about them? We use those two measurements, VOC and ISC, when we're designing the system, because that's the theoretical worst case scenario. That's the most amps it's going to be exposed to, and that's the most volts it's going to be exposed to. So that's what we're going to base our design on. But it doesn't operate in those realms, because if it did, it wouldn't be functioning. All right, so then we've already identified what the maximum power point is. So there is a voltage associated with it, and there is an amperage associated with it. And the voltage is the VMP, the volts at the maximum power point, or sometimes they just call it Vmax. And the amperage associated with the maximum power point is the Imax or the IMP. Unfortunately, these terms are not standardized. So we do that, and so this would be your operating amperage, and this would be your operating voltage. when it is functioning at the maximum power point. So let me go ahead and clear this. So the terms are a little bit confusing because you would think that the VMP, the volts at the maximum power point, or VMP, Vmax, is the maximum voltage, but it's not. The VOC is. It's just the voltage when the panel is producing the most power. And we talk about this in terms of STC. Whoops, I need to get my pen back. So if this is your IV curve, make it just a wee bit thicker. All right, so if this is the IV curve here, my curves with this are not great. That's usually the IV curve. The one that we're given on the spec sheet is at STC. And STC says 1,000 watts per square meter. It's also 1.5 atmospheres and 25 degrees Celsius. So this is the curve that you're going to see under standard test conditions. Well, those standard test conditions don't usually apply. It might, but it's rare. So this might be your maximum power point under STC. But let's say that it gets colder. So volts are usually affected by temperature. Amps are going to be affected by irradiance or sunlight. So if it gets colder, this system will produce more volts. So at 25, it might produce what's on that first line. But let's say at 20 degrees Celsius, that's going to be your line. And the maximum power point actually shifts. And then if it gets colder still, let's say 10 degrees, it's going to look something like that. That's a bad 10. All right, so it keeps shifting, and the maximum power point keeps shifting as well. Let's say a cloud comes over. Well, now the irradiance, the amps, is going to be affected. The volts not so much, but now that maximum power point is shifted over here. And if, it would be great if the panel kept adjusting its production so it was always producing at the maximum given the specific situation it's facing, the temperature and the irradiance. And fortunately, there's a device called the MPPT, the maximum power point tracking device, and that's located in the first piece of electronics that is connected to that panel. And that is going to just automatically adjust on a millisecond by millisecond basis where the generation is, where that panel is going to generate. And it's going to be jumping all over the place as temperatures change and as irradiance changes. So it's not an expensive item. It's in every piece of electronics that's connected to it. So it's something you don't even have to think about. But remember, the maximum power point is based on the conditions it's facing at the moment. And that'll come into play a little bit later because the conditions that we're given are based on measurements at STC. But we will have to adjust that based on conditions as we find them. So that's usually going to be, either you'll make an adjustment on the production based on what the actual measurements are, or in your design, you're going to base your design not on STC, but based on the coldest temperature ever experienced at the site and the hottest temperature ever experienced at the site. So we're going to make some of those adjustments. And of course, the numbers that we're worried about that we need to know and in our design from this curve, there is the ISC, the amps short circuit, as I mentioned, that's amperage that is maximum theoretical. And we'll use that when we begin to size our wires. So we want our wires to be able to handle the maximum amperage. So we'll use ISC as our starting point, even though our system should never operate there. We're just erring on the side of caution. And then VOC we'll use as our voltage. And we do that because the National Electrical Code says for residential systems, you can't be over 600 volts. For commercial systems, you can't be over, what is it, 1,000 volts? And so you have to make those adjustments. So based on temperature, so you want to make sure. Now the maximum power point is where it produces the most power. Then we're going to want to know the VMP, and we're going to want to know the IMP or the IMAX. These are going to be your actual operating conditions. So this is your MPP or your Pmax. And those are the 5 different things that we're going to need to know as far as measurements from the solar panel. Fortunately, the solar panel manufacturer is going to give you those numbers. So you'll be able to operate from the spec sheet on that, which is one of the reasons we have that spec sheet problem there in the lab. Okay. All right. Well, I'll just talk through it. Okay. So the lesson content, I think those are typically the ones we're worried about, but the chapter 3, when we get into it, we're dealing with the standalone systems. So we're really talking about the various configurations, and that's going to be standalone. Then it's going to be grid-tied systems, simple grid-tied systems. And then it's also going to be our, I'm messing this thing up. Okay, nope. All right, I keep getting multiple screens opening. All right, I don't want to mess that up. All right, so anyway, so the three issues there are going to be standalone systems, simple grid-tied systems, and then grid interactive systems. There's AC coupled and there's DC coupled. So more and more standalone systems are a minority of the systems that we have. And there's what I was looking for. All right. And I think I can bring us back online. And so the standalone systems are going to be a minority of the systems that we're dealing with, but they're also probably the most complicated. Then we get into simple grid-tied systems, which are the least expensive systems, but they're also, and they're the simplest. But the problem that you have with a simple grid-tied system is if the grid goes down, you don't have power because of islanding. So the islanding shuts off your system when the grid is not operational, so that you're not backfeeding power onto the grid where you might kill somebody who's out there working on the transmission lines. Then you have grid interactive or AC coupled and DC coupled systems. And that's the best of both worlds. They act like a grid tied system when the grid is operational. But when the grid goes down, there's a transformer switch or an auto transfer switch, and it disconnects you from the grid. It physically disconnects you from the grid, and then it puts you in standalone mode. That's a great system, but it's also the most expensive. So that's, we're seeing more and more systems transferring over to that last option. And the reason for that is sort of 3 or 4-fold. One is the grid is increasingly unreliable. So you end up with the grid going down a lot, and people don't want to experience that discomfort, that problem. So they're putting in battery backup, and then they have their system available if the grid goes down. And you can then power critical loads, or you can power your whole house. It just depends on how much battery you want to invest in. The other reason why you might do that is if the local utility has instituted what's referred to as time of day pricing. And so during peak energy demand, they're going to charge you more money for the electricity that you're using because it costs them more to produce it. So what you could do if you have battery backup is store power, use it when energy is expensive from your batteries rather than buying it from the grid, and then recharge it either from your solar array or from the grid when power is inexpensive. So you're just kind of using batteries, using your solar array to levelize the cost of your power. So that's another reason that people will often put in battery backup systems and do an AC coupled or a DC coupled system. And then the third reason is utilities are starting to get away from just simple net metering. Simple net metering means when I have extra power and I feed it back to the grid, I get paid retail for that power. So my meter runs backwards, my reader runs forwards when I need power, and I only pay the difference. So I'm effectively getting paid retail. Well, that's great. And you can use the grid essentially as a battery. But more and more utilities are going, why are we paying you retail for this power? We're in the business of selling power. So we will pay you wholesale for what you send back to us. And then we'll charge you retail for what you buy from us. So when you do it that way, if I have extra power in the middle of the day and I send it back to the utility, I might only get paid 5 cents a kilowatt hour for that. And then when I do need power, I'm going to pay them 20 cents a kilowatt hour. Well, I'm on the short end of the deal both directions. So why don't I just put in a battery and store power when I need it or when I have it, when it's abundant, and then use it rather than pay full retail, rather than pay 20 cents a kilowatt hour and get paid 5 cents. I'll just keep it. I'm not going to sell it to you at that discount. I'm just going to hold on to it. Well, that requires that you have batteries as well. So that's referred to as self-consumption. So you've got self-consumption because the amount they're going to pay you for your power is not high enough. You've got basically making your power as inexpensive as possible because of time of day pricing. And then you've got an unreliable grid where your batteries are basically there to back up the grid. So those are the three main reasons. And when I talk about an AC coupled and a DC coupled system, they function very similarly. The only difference is the power that's going into the battery is either going to be DC or it's going to be AC. So if you're setting up a system from the beginning and you say, okay, I've got DC power coming from my array, I've got DC power that gets stored in the battery. So why not just take the power directly and put it into the battery? So that would be a DC coupled system. But an AC coupled system may be one where the DC power has already been converted to AC. Either you have an existing system and now you're adding batteries to it, or you're using microinverters, where the panel, right at the panel, it's converted to AC. So that AC then has to be converted from AC to DC before it can be stored into the battery. So it has to go through that rectifying process. And then in the battery, you leave and now it's DC, but you got to convert it to AC to use it. So your system is actually going through 3 conversions. It's going from DC at the panel to AC, then from AC to DC to get into the battery, and then from the battery to AC. So, and every time you go through a conversion, there's a bit of a loss. So people would argue that AC coupled systems are not as efficient, but there are a number of reasons, a lot of reasons why you might use them, especially if you're putting in a microinverter system because you have no other choice. But DC, basically, you're only going through one conversion. You're going from a DC panel to a DC battery, and then from the battery, you're converting it to AC. A little bit more efficient. Those are the differences. And then in chapter 3, we then end that with how to calculate loads. And I think that's pretty straightforward. So I'm going to cut it off there. If you have any questions throughout the week, just send me an email. And hopefully everybody's progressing. And then we'll meet again next Tuesday. And maybe we'll have more folks online at that point. And I think that's it. Nigel, did you have any questions before we jump off? Give me just a check. It must not have been pressing. I know you're doing it in chat, but all right, I'm going to go ahead and, oh, what is the address of our office? Okay, yeah, the address is 622 8th Street in Marietta. So 622, I'll put it in chat. Yeah, I think we'll be holding the exam and the face-to-face here at the office. So 622 8th Street. I'll be giving you directions and all of that later. But all right. Okay, great. So that's it. And we'll see you next week. All right. And I do invite you all to attend the Solar Noon Tuesday meetings. That's just before this session. So hopefully we'll see you there. All right. Take care.